Hey guys, welcome back to Learn Python the Hard Way. Today we're going to take a look at prompting people and exercise 12. And as always, you can find the link to the exercise in the description below, but you would need to have a paid copy of this, or you can just follow along, of course. So in the previous video, we took a look at the input function, and we used it to collect some user input and assign it to a variable. And it's actually also possible to use the input method and to pass in an argument. So here, instead of writing input, open parentheses, close parentheses, we can pass in a string. So here, for example, quotation mark, name, question mark, space, and then double quotes again. And this is gonna cause a prompt to display whatever you typed in between those parentheses. So here, for example, this prompts the user with name, question mark, and then in this case we would assign the input that the user provides to the variable y. And then of course we can use that variable and, for example, print it out using the print function. So therefore we can basically rewrite our previous exercise by just using input without having to rely on print. And let's get started and take a look at the code itself and type it out. I just opened my terminal here, which again you can open by pressing Command and space on your Mac, or alternatively, if you're using Windows, you can use a separate application. And then we navigated to the appropriate location, and I'm going to open a new Python file by typing out code for Visual Studio Code, which is the text editor I'm using, followed by the name of the file. So in this case, exercise12.python. Now once that opened up, let's get started and type out this code here. So we are creating an h variable, and what we assign to that variable is the result of calling input. And this time, instead of actually adding a print statement and then adding the call to input, we are instead just putting in those strings directly within the input method. So it's going to print out how old are you, and then as you type in the answer, it's going to be stored in the h variable. So we basically save an additional line here. And let's do the same for the next question. How tall are you? And again, we're adding a little space at the end, so that as we provide the answer, it's not directly connected to the string here, to the question, but instead there's a space in between. Then finally we have our weight. How much, let me just capitalize that. How much do you weigh? All right, and then we can print this out using the print method and using f, so printf. And again, that's pretty much the same as we saw in the previous video. But what changed, of course, is the upper section here. All right, so let's save this. And then we can hop over to our terminal and type out Python, the version of Python, so Python 3 or Python 3.6, followed by the exercise, or the code file rather, and let's press enter. And again, it's asking us how old we are. Let's just enter the same input as here in the example. So we're going to type out 38. How tall are we? So 6'2". And how much do you weigh? 180 pounds. And again, it's printing out in this print statement the value for the variables which we just provided. So we basically have the same result, but when you compare to the previous code file, we actually have a lot fewer lines of code. So if we just compare that again to the previous code file here, which is pretty much the section here on top. In the previous exercise, we had a separate print statement followed by the assignment to the variable. And now what we entered here in the print statement, pretty much this here, is now included in the input statement. And so we basically save those 3 print lines and we can reduce our code quite significantly. So that's the exercise. Let's take a look at the study drills in our terminal. So let's just open it up again over here. We have been using Python 3.6, so the name of the Python version, followed by the name of the script to actually execute our code. But instead now let's type out PyDoc, so the Python documentation, followed by the name of the function, so followed by input that we want to take a look at. And now as I press enter, we can see we switch over to the documentation, and here we can find the input function again. This is a help on built-in function input in a specific module. So we're gonna type out input. Optionally we can provide a prompt, which is basically the string we entered, and then it's gonna return a value. Alright, to get out of the documentation we could just have to press Q, and now we can repeat this step, or rather let's look online what the PyDoc command does. So here we can see the PyDoc module automatically generates documentation from Python modules. The documentation can be presented as pages of text on the console, served to a web browser, or saved to an HTML file. So what we saw was the first one here, presented as page of text on the console. And then there's of course a lot more information on that. So in general we just type out PyDoc followed by the name of the specific module or the specific function that we want to take a look at, and we're gonna find some additional documentation about that. Alright, so let's use PyDoc to read about some additional functions here: open, file, OS, and sys. So let's type out PyDoc space open. So here we see open is a function that takes a name and then some additional optional arguments and returns a file object. To open a file using file type returns a file object. This is the preferred way to open a file. So if we want to work with files in Python, then we can use that open method or open function. Next, let's take a look at file, the PyDoc documentation, so it's a little bit more extensive. So that opens a file, we can use different modes, R, W, or A for reading, which is a default mode, writing, or appending. The file will be created if it doesn't exist when open for writing or appending. It will be truncated when open for writing. Alright, so file would be used if we want to actually work with any text documents. For example, if we want to read them, write them, or append them. So it's similar in a way to open, but it's more file oriented if we want to do any operations on that, while open would open a file. So let's take a look at OS next. So that's more extensive. That's a module, and we can find additional resources here by following that link to take a look at the online documentation. So this exports all functions from POSIX, so on and so forth. Programs that import and use OS stand a better chance of being portable between different platforms. Of course, they must then only use functions that are defined by all platforms. So it's helpful if we want to work on a more, as the name suggests, operating system basis. So for that it can be quite useful. And that's quite a long documentation, and we can use J and K to basically scroll up and down. And of course, if we type Q again, we exit that documentation. Let's finally take a look at sys, which was also the example we saw here on the online PyDoc documentation. So again, this is linking to the online module docs. And this module here provides access to some objects used or maintained by the interpreter, and to functions that interact strongly with the interpreter. All right, so if you want to use some standard input or output, then we would use the sys module here. So that's directly operating on the interpreter basis. So for example, here we can use argv to provide some argument names. So as we are executing our code, as we did previously here, if we want to pass some arguments to it, we could do so using that sys module. So here, for example, if we had a command line argument, we could pass it in there, and that's what the module allows us to do. All right, so that's quite handy to know that we can use the pydoc command to directly look up some information. Of course, we're still able to always Google, but it's still quite handy if you want to quickly look something up. Let's take a look at some of the common student questions. The first one is, how come I get a syntax error, invalid syntax, when I run pydoc? In that case, that can happen if we are not running pydoc from the command line, but if we are running it, for example, from inside of Python 3.6, which would be if we actually type that out here to open the interpreter. And then if we now enter pydoc, we would get an error here. So we always have to make sure we are outside of that, and then we would enter the command here. Why does my pydoc not pause like yours does? Okay, so sometimes if the help document is short enough to fit on one screen, then pydoc will just print it. So we saw that before as we took a look at open, for example, a file that was rather short, so we didn't have to scroll. When I run pydoc, I get more is not recognized as an internal. So some versions of Windows do not have that command, which means pydoc is broken for you. You can skip the study drill and just search online for Python documentation when needed. All right, so we can always just take a look online, and in a lot of cases that might be even more useful, especially if you're looking for some code examples. But still, if it works, then of course we can also use it if we maybe don't have internet access. Why can't I do print hold ru, input? You can, but then the result of calling input is never saved to a variable, and it will work in a strange way. Try this and then try to print out what you type. See if you can debug why this isn't working. All right, so let's do that here. For now, I'm just gonna comment out that code here, and then we can type out print hold ru, and then we pass input to that. Okay, so it's not stored to a variable, so there's really no way to access that later. So let me just switch over here and type out Python 3.6, or we can just type Python 3. It's going to use the latest version, exercise 12.python. Press enter. All right, so let me just enter some value. All right, so what it does here, it first calls the input function, so I directly have to enter a name, and then it prints out hold ru, and it already shows the value. So that's really confusing because we are asking for the value, the input, before we actually ask the question, and that of course can be very confusing. So therefore it makes a lot more sense to actually call the input method instead, as we did up here, and then, for example, store that in a variable and afterwards print it out. So we are not in that confusing situation, and we actually print the message first before we ask for the input. So that's it for exercise 12 for this video. See you guys next time when we will continue with the next exercise.